How to play Dwarf Mine RPG in under 10 minutes. Dwarf Mine is a solo RPG come Roll-And-Write by James Hron, I hope I said that name right, from Paper Dice Games, and is currently going for about $7 US, that is. You can pick it up for cheap sometimes, so it's worth checking just to find out if there is a sale going on. It's a mapping dungeon building game where you create a mine, you dig deeper, and you try to stay alive as long as you possibly can to essentially create an empire and do the best that you possibly can. It's about 30 minutes in length once you know what you're doing. It's fairly similar to Anna Blackwell's Delve RPG. As you create a dungeon, you manage your population and resources, and you have to draw it as it goes along. However, it sits between this and 4 Against Darkness, as you need to draw some rooms and some corridors of different sizes and shapes. You need to work out how those interact together to make sure that you're building something that works physically and doesn't put you in too much danger. And then in addition to that, the resource pool is a lot more limited than other management games, particularly Delve RPG. There are only about 5 things that you realistically need to keep your eye on, and they're quite simple as you go through the game. You need a D4, a D6, a D8, a D10, a D12 and a D20 dice to play. However, you'll only be rolling one of these at any given time, so there's no dice management or other, but you do need the whole set of dice. You will, generally speaking, go at least up to a D12 within the game. However, it's highly likely that you use all of them. There are 2 play areas for this game. The first is the map mine itself. The core game only has one design, but by changing where you start your mine from, anywhere at the top, and the random nature of the game, it can drastically change the way your game is played and sort of add interest. There are also some advanced rules that we'll get onto later that can develop this slightly further too. The map mine is basically a large squared or dotted grid. However, on the right side of the grid is broken up into 4 unequal sections. As your mine goes deeper and deeper and further into these sections, the higher the reward. However, there's also more danger. So initially you need to make sure that your mine is as built up as possible in the lower sections, the lower numbers, 1 or 2. As you then start pushing yourself into 3 and 4, by that point you really should have a good understanding of the game and should be able to tackle some of the more dangerous areas. The second play area consists of a large area to chronicle your game. This is completely optional, you don't actually need to do it. And then secondly is an area for trekking stats. Now this is split into 3 different sections, we'll talk about those separately. The first is your resources, gold, ore and other, which is unique special items that you can gain through your playthrough. Most notably there's something called a mithril ore that you're likely to come across at some point. The section is your score section. This is your mind age, how deep you've gone in your mind, your population and your prestige. You don't really need to concentrate on any of these unless you want to. This is more of a case of trying to compete with yourself as time goes on. However, population is important. Population essentially acts as your health. If this drops to 0, that's the end of your mine. And finally, the dice area. Now I know this looks complicated, but it's not. Essentially you start off with a D4 for attacks. You can purchase buildings or rooms to increase your dice that you use, starting with a D6, D8, D10, D12 and then finally a D20. This essentially just chronicles exactly where you are and which dice you should be using, so it's not as complicated as it does look. The game itself consists of rounds. Each round has 4 parts. Part 1 is simply updating your mine age. You do this on every round apart from your first round, meaning it starts at 0. Every time that you roll on the table you have to use this mine age, so it's a really important thing that you are making reference to it. Part 2 is the building phase. You can build corridors and, if you can afford them, you can also build rooms. You can build as many corridors as you want for free each turn, but rooms do cost money or sometimes special items and sometimes a combination of each. Each of these rooms give you a boost in some way and each has its own shape that you must fit into your dungeon. There are also at least 1 square between each room and they must connect by a corridor to another room. You can't have them on their own without a corridor. You can build as many rooms as you can afford in every given turn, And it's worth noting that you should also probably build at least something every turn, even if it's just a tiny 1x1 corridor, because the deeper that you go, the more danger there is. You want to make sure that you try to keep as high as possible when building all of these buildings and corridors. Now, the reason that you want to build something is the next phase, phase 3, the treasure phase. Now, if you built anything at all, it does not matter what, corridor or building, in part 2, you can roll on the treasure table. You look up your treasure table for the deepest part of your mine, and you roll a d8 and then add your mine age. Whatever you get in this table is what you physically found whilst mining. You only roll once, regardless of how much you have mined within that previous phase. Phase 4 is the combat phase. Once again, you look up on the combat table for the deepest part of your mine, and then you roll a d8 and you add your mine age. Combat is made up of attacking and defending, which happens at the same time. Using the attacking die that you found on your mine sheet, you will roll this, and the amount of damage that you've done to your enemy is that given number on your dice. Therefore, the higher the dice, the more likely that you are to have a higher amount of damage done to your enemy. Defending is exactly the same, but of course it uses the attacking dice of the enemy. That is defined into the table, and any damage that they do reduces your population by that amount. This process repeats until you have either 0 population and you've lost, or the enemy has 0 life and they have died. You repeat these 4 phases until you have either built up a mine that's able to continue regardless of the dangers that are incumbent upon you, or until you have died, in which case you need to look at your prestige, your age level, and just how long it took you in order to get there and how much gold that you have at the end of it. Essentially, it is a points-based system, but there is no tracking as such to compare. It's purely up to you. There's some expansions to the game, both free and paid. The free expansions add more rooms, they add more variation to your mountains, different players that you can use, there are more enemies, and there are some missions to achieve as well. And there are also some paid expansions. Roughly speaking, they're about $5 at the moment, and they all have new mountain maps that you can use, and they have unique obstacles, making the game slightly harder. There is a sci-fi version with a crashed ship, there's a power-infested mountain with wizard's powers, and there's something called the Underdark, a massive open space in Zone 4 specifically that makes building in that area particularly complicated. Overall, this is a great game, mixes mapping, strategy, base building and management all together really well. It takes about 30 minutes to play a session, it has some great repay value, and of course it's fairly cheap. It does initially seem fairly simple considering there is a limited pool of buildings that you can use, but actually there's a lot of strategy going on here, and if you compete against yourself and your friends, there's a lot of replay value that you can really try to improve your strategy to.